Imagine being chosen as a royal concubine thinking you have secured a life of luxury and privilege, only to discover that when your pharaoh dies, you will be drugged paralyzed while still conscious, and mummified alive wrapped in resin-soaked linen while your lungs still fight for air, your heart still beats, and your eyes still see the priests sealing you into eternal darkness. You were told you would serve him in the afterlife. You were never told you would be buried awake. You were promised honor. You were never told about the natron salt that would burn your throat as they forced it down. You were never told about the hooks that would enter your nose while you could still feel pain. You were never told the rapping would begin before you stopped breathing. You were never told the tomb door would close while you could still hear it. In a few minutes, you will understand what the priests discovered in the preparation chamber. In a few minutes, you will understand why certain mummies show claw marks on the inside of their wrappings. In a few minutes, you will understand why ancient Egyptian concubine burial was not about devotion. It was about possession. This is not fiction, this was religious law. This happened in the burial complexes of Egypt's most powerful dynasties for over 500 years. Herodotus, the Greek historian who traveled to Egypt in 450 BCE, described practices so disturbing that modern Egyptologists initially dismissed his accounts as exaggeration. He wrote of women being prepared for the next world, while the breath of this world still moved in them. Diodorus Siculus, writing in the 1st century BCE, mentioned concubines who entered the tomb alive by sacred custom, and Strabo recorded that certain royal women were given to the afterlife before death claimed them. And yet, these were not murders. They were rituals, mandatory, sacred. Document. What they tried to erase from history, we are about to uncover. What Egyptian priests avoided recording in temple inscriptions, we will reveal in full. Before we go deeper into Neferet's story, if you want more hidden histories they tried to bury forever, subscribe now and hit the bell, because once you hear what happened to 23-year-old Neferet in the preparation chamber beneath Pharaoh Amenemhat's mortuary temple, you will never see ancient Egypt the same way again. And when you reach the moment that disturbs you most, and you will tell me in the comments where you are watching from and what shocked you the most. The year was 1853 BCE. The Nile floods had receded, and Neferet, dressed in fine linen and anointed with myrrh oil, had no idea that the honor she was about to receive would trap her in conscious darkness for eternity, until archaeologists opened her tomb 37 centuries later and discovered what no one was supposed to see. Neferet had been a royal concubine for 6 years, not a wife. Those positions belonged to women of noble blood, strategic alliances forged between powerful families. Concubines were different. Chosen for beauty, trained in music and dance, kept in the harem complex on the palace's western side. She had been 14 when the royal selectors came to her village. They examined her teeth, her hair, her posture. They paid her father in grain and copper. She never returned home. Life in the harem was not cruel. She learned to play the sistrum, the ritual rattle used in temple ceremonies. She learned to apply kohl and arrange her wig in the styles that pleased the pharaoh. She learned which nights she would be summoned and which nights she would wait. She bore no children. There were herbs for that, carefully administered by the harem physicians. Royal bloodlines could not be diluted by concubine pregnancies, but she was comfortable, fed, protected. She told herself she was fortunate. Then Pharaoh Amenemhat III died. The death was expected. He was 72 years old, his body worn from decades of rule. When the news reached the harem, the other women wept theatrically, tearing their clothes as custom demanded. But Neferet noticed something else. The head harem keeper, a woman named Izzet, who had served 3 pharaohs, watched them with an expression Neferet could not decipher. Not grief, not relief. Something closer to evaluation. 3 days later, Izzet came to Neferet's chamber. She carried a wooden box inlaid with gold. "You have been chosen," Izzet said. Her voice held no emotion. "The priests have selected you to accompany the Divine One into eternity. You will serve him in the field of reeds. You will be honored above all other concubines. Your name will be inscribed on his tomb chapel, You will never be forgotten. Neferet's heart surged with something between pride and confusion. Honored, remembered, inscribed, these were privileges beyond what any concubine could expect. But something in Izzet's eyes made her throat tighten. When? Neferet whispered. Tomorrow. At dawn. The priests will come for you. That night, Neferet could not sleep. She tried to feel grateful. She tried to feel chosen. But her hands would not stop shaking. She noticed a crack in the mud brick wall above her sleeping mat. She memorized its shape, counted the ridges, focused on that small imperfection instead of the growing dread that coiled in her stomach like a serpent. At dawn, 2 Sempriests entered her chamber. They wore leopard skins over their linen kilts. Their heads were shaved. They carried no weapons, but their presence filled the small room with authority that allowed no resistance. They bathed her first, not in her chamber, but in a preparation room beneath the mortuary temple, a place she had never seen before. The walls were painted with scenes of the afterlife, Anubis weighing hearts, Osiris seated on his throne, the devourer waiting with crocodile jaws. But what caught her attention was the long stone table in the center of the room and the channels carved into its surface. Channels for drainage. The priests washed her with water, infused with natron salt and juniper oil. They shaved her head completely, removing every strand of hair. They anointed her with myrrh and frankincense. They dressed her in the finest linen she had ever touched, so fine it was nearly transparent. They placed a collar of gold and turquoise around her neck. They painted her face with ochre and kohl, her lips with red clay. She looked like a goddess. She felt like livestock being prepared for slaughter. But the priests smiled at her. They murmured blessings. They told her how honored she was, how fortunate, how the pharaoh would cherish her service in the afterlife. Their voices were kind. That should have been reassuring. It was not. Then the high priest entered. He was old, his face deeply lined, his eyes clouded with cataracts, but his voice was steady, formal. He carried a small cup made of blue faience. "Drink," he commanded. Neferet looked into the cup. The liquid inside was dark brown, thick, and smelled of earth and bitterness. Herbs floated on the surface. She recognized poppy and mandrake, plants used to dull pain and bring visions. "What is it?" Her voice cracked. "It will ease your journey. You will feel no fear, no pain, only peace as you cross into eternity." She wanted to ask more. She wanted to refuse. But 4 priests now stood around her, their leopard skins gleaming in lamplight, their faces patient but unyielding. There was no door behind her, no escape, no choice, only compliance. She drank. The taste was vile bitter beyond anything she had ever experienced. She gagged. The priest held the cup to her lips until every drop was gone. Then they gave her honey water to wash away the taste. She swallowed gratefully. For several minutes, nothing happened. She stood there, surrounded by priests, feeling only the coolness of the stone floor beneath her bare feet. Maybe the drink was only ceremonial. Maybe the story she had half remembered from childhood, the whispered warnings older women shared, were only rumors meant to frighten. Then her fingers began to tingle. The sensation spread up her arms. Not unpleasant at first, like the numbness after sleeping in an awkward position. But it continued, into her shoulders, down her spine, into her legs. She tried to step forward. Her legs would not obey. She tried to lift her arm. It hung limp at her side. Panic surged through her chest. She opened her mouth to scream. No sound emerged. Her throat had stopped working. Her tongue lay heavy and useless. She could not even close her lips, but her eyes still worked. She could see everything. She could see the priests moving around her with practiced efficiency. She could see them lowering her onto the stone table. She could feel the cold surface against her back. She could feel her heart hammering against her ribs. She could feel her lungs pulling in air, shallow and rapid. She was paralyzed. But she was not unconscious. Not asleep. Not absent. She was awake. Fully. Terribly awake. One of the priests leaned over her. He looked into her eyes. He must have seen the terror there, the frantic awareness. But his expression did not change. "Do not be afraid," he said softly. "The drug has taken hold. Your body sleeps, but your spirit remains aware so that it can guide you into the afterlife. This is the sacred transition. This is how the gods designed it. No, no." This was not what she had imagined. She thought there would be poison, swift and final, or a blade, quick and certain. Not this, not awareness trapped inside a body that would no longer obey. But the examination was only the beginning. The high priest's next words would reveal something far worse. "Begin the purification," he commanded. Two priests approached with a long bronze hook. The tip was narrow, slightly curved, designed for precision. Neferet's vision tunneled. She could not look away. Her eyelids would not close. They inserted the hook into her left nostril. The pain was immediate, searing, and absolute. She could not scream. She could not thrash. She could not do anything but feel as the hook pierced through the thin bone at the back of her nasal cavity and entered her skull. The priests worked methodically. They were not removing her brain that would come later, after death, during full mummification. This was different. This was partial cranial access, a procedure Roman-era physician Cornelius Celsus would later describe with clinical horror in his medical texts. The priests were creating channels, passages, routes through which the sacred oils and resins could enter while she still lived. They inserted thin reeds into the openings. Through these they poured heated cedar oil mixed with myrrh resin. The liquid burned as it entered her skull. She felt it spreading behind her eyes, pooling in cavities she did not know existed. The pressure was unbearable. She thought her skull would crack. But it did not. It held, and the pouring continued. When they finished with her head, they moved to her abdomen. The priests made a small incision just below her rib cage on the left side. Not large, barely the width of 2 fingers. But deep. She felt the blade enter. Felt it cut through skin, through muscle, through the membrane protecting her organs. Felt warm blood pool beneath her paralyzed body. Through the incision, they inserted a long bronze tube. Through this tube, they poured more of the heated resin mixture. It flowed into her abdominal cavity, coating her stomach, her liver, her intestines. The heat was internal now, radiating through her core. She could feel every organ the liquid touched, could feel them beginning to cook from the inside. This was not mummification. Not yet. This was preservation. Chemical preservation, while the body still functioned. The resins would slow decay. The oils would begin the drying process, so that when death finally came hours or days from now, the body would already be partially prepared, already beginning its transformation into an eternal vessel. Herodotus, witnessing similar procedures centuries later, wrote, "The Egyptians have a custom too horrible to record in full. When a man of great importance dies, certain of his women are prepared to follow him while life still moves within them. The priests apply arts of preservation before the final breath departs, so that the body does not corrupt in the days between death and burial." He called it too horrible to record in full. He wrote that line in 450 BCE, and modern scholars spend 2,000 years assuming he exaggerated, assuming no civilization could be that precise in its cruelty, assuming he misunderstood what he saw. Until 1923, when archaeologist Herbert Winlock opened a tomb in the Deir el-Bahari complex. Inside, he found the bodies of 60 women, all concubines of Pharaoh Mentuhotep II. All concubines of Pharaoh Mentuhotep II. All mummified. But something was wrong. 23 of the bodies showed signs of advanced preservation techniques, cranial resin insertion, abdominal cavity treatment, but also showed something else. Microscopic analysis revealed tissue damage consistent with these procedures being performed before circulatory cessation, before the heart stopped pumping, while blood still flowed. The official Egyptology report, published in 1924 and immediately buried in academic archives, noted, "Evidence suggests preservation protocols initiated prior to clinical death." Implications remain unclear. The implications were not unclear. They were unbearable. But Neferet's ordeal was not finished. The priests were only beginning. They carried her paralyzed body to a different chamber. This one was smaller, hotter, lit by dozens of oil lamps. In the center stood a wooden frame shaped like a sarcophagus, stood upright. They placed her inside it, positioning her arms crossed over her chest, her legs straight, her head tilted slightly back. Then they began wrapping. The first layer of linen was thin, nearly sheer. They wrapped it around her feet, her ankles, her calves. Each wrap was dipped in heated resin before application. The resin burned her skin. She could feel every inch of fabric adhering to her body. Could feel the heat, the tightness, the suffocating pressure. They worked slowly, methodically, wrapping her legs, then her torso, then her arms. They chanted prayers as they worked hymns to Anubis, to Osiris, to the gods who govern death and resurrection. They asked for safe passage. They asked for a safe passage. They asked for eternal service. They asked that her K remain bound to the pharaoh in the field of reeds. No one asked what she wanted. No one checked if she could still feel. No one considered that inside the rapidly forming cocoon, a living woman was screaming silently. Her mind intact, her awareness absolute, her body completely unresponsive. When they reached her chest, she felt the wrapping constrict her lungs. Each breath became harder, shallower. The paralytic drug kept her from gasping, from fighting, but it did not stop her lungs from working. Not yet. They continued pulling in air, less with each wrap, but still trying, still fighting. The priests wrapped her shoulders, her neck. They placed amulets between the layers, scarabs for protection, jed pillars for stability, the eye of Horus for wholeness. Each amulet was positioned according to ritual precision. Each had a purpose. Each would ensure her effectiveness as an eternal servant. Then they reached her face. They placed linen pads over her eyes. She could no longer see. Only darkness. Only the sound of chanting. Only the smell of resin and smoke. Only the feeling of fabric covering her nose, her mouth, her entire head. Layer after layer, wrap after wrap. Her lungs were barely moving now. The combination of the paralytic, the constriction, and the resin fumes was shutting her body down. But her mind remained, still aware, still present, still trapped. The wrapping continued. More layers, more resin. The priests worked for hours. When they finished, Neferet was no longer a person. She was an object, a sacred bundle, a mummy. But inside, her heart still beat. Once, twice, 10 times, 20, and then it stopped. Modern forensic analysis conducted in 2003 on similarly preserved remains confirmed what archaeologists had suspected, but never publicly stated. Trace evidence of carbon dioxide in lung tissue, cellular stress markers in cardiac tissue, and resin penetration patterns indicated that wrapping procedures were completed while subjects retained minimal cardiopulmonary function. In medical terms, they were buried alive. In religious terms, they were consecrated while the K could still be bound. The truth was darker than anyone admitted. They carried Neferet's wrapped body into Pharaoh Amenemhat's tomb. They placed her in a small side chamber, one of 8 concubines similarly prepared. They positioned her sarcophagus upright against the wall, facing the pharaoh's main burial chamber. They left offerings, bread, beer, meat food for the afterlife. They sealed the chamber with stone blocks. They plastered over the entrance. They painted it with protective spells. And then they walked away. Into sunlight. Into life. leaving Neferet in eternal darkness. For 37 centuries, no one knew. The tomb was lost to sand and time. The entrance collapsed. The memory faded. The practice was forgotten or deliberately erased when Egypt converted to Christianity, and historians like Augustine called such rituals pagan abominations too disturbing to record. Until 1890, when British archaeologist Flinders Petrie excavated a Middle Kingdom tomb complex and found something that made him physically ill. He recorded it in his field notes, but did not publish the full findings until years later. He wrote, "The subsidiary burial showed signs of irregularity. I cannot write it plainly. If my suspicions are correct, the practice was monstrous beyond imagining." His suspicions were correct. Subsequent excavations throughout the 20th century uncovered more evidence, more concubine chambers, more bodies with pre-death preservation indicators, more tomb art showing women being dressed for eternity while surrounded by living priests. The pattern was undeniable. But peer-reviewed Egyptology journals refused to publish the full conclusions. Museum exhibits displayed concubine mummies as honored companions who chose to follow their pharaohs. Educational documentaries described the practice as ritual sacrifice, quick, painless, devoted. No one mentioned the drugs, the paralysis, the conscious wrapping, the slow suffocation. Until 2011, when bioarchaeologist Dr. Salima Ikram analyzed tissue samples from 12 concubine mummies using advanced imaging techniques. She found microscopic evidence that preservation procedures had been performed while circulation was still active. She published her findings in the Journal of Egyptian Archaeology. The paper was met with institutional resistance. 2 senior Egyptologists called for its retraction. The Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities issued a formal statement denying the possibility. But the evidence did not lie. The women did not lie. Their bodies told stories. Their names could not. Neferet's name was found inscribed in the tomb chapel, exactly as promised. Neferet, honored concubine, servant in eternity. Just her name. No age, no hometown, no mention of what she endured. But archaeologists found something else. Something no one expected. When they carefully unwrapped her mummy in a controlled laboratory environment in 1998, they discovered that the innermost layers of linen near her hands showed displacement patterns. Slight bunching. Fabric pulled tighter in some areas than others. Microscopic analysis suggested the fabric had been gripped, squeezed, pulled. Her hands had moved. Inside the wrappings. After the priests left. Not much. The paralytic and constriction would have prevented any significant motion. But enough. Enough to disturb the linen. Enough to indicate that some small part of her body regained minimal function in those final moments. Enough to show that she tried. The final medical assessment concluded she had been conscious for approximately 2 to 3 hours after wrapping was completed. Her heart had continued beating for at least 45 minutes after the tomb was sealed. She had died slowly. Alone, in absolute darkness. Fully aware, this was not cruelty, this was theology. The Egyptians believed the Ka'ali force had to be present during preservation to ensure successful resurrection. If the person died before wrapping, the Ka might escape, leaving only an empty vessel. But if they preserved the body while the Ka was still bound within it, the transition would be seamless. Perfect. Divine. The logic was impeccable, the execution was monstrous, and the truth was hidden for 3,000 years. But Neferet's story does not end in that tomb. In 2014, a papyrus fragment was discovered in a private collection in London. It had been looted from an Egyptian site in the 1890s and sold to a British collector who never translated it. When researchers finally examined it, they found something extraordinary. It was a letter written by a concubine named Merit to her sister, dated approximately 1840 BCE, just 13 years after Neferet's death. Merit had served in the same harem. She had watched the selections, she had seen the priests come for other women, and she had done something no one else dared. She ran. When her pharaoh died and the priests began making their selections, Merit was not chosen. But she knew she could be. She knew that any day, any hour, they could come for her too. So she stole a wig, a simple dress, and a small pouch of grain. She walked out of the harem complex at dawn, pretending to be a servant going to market. She kept walking. Out of the palace district. Out of the city. Into the countryside. She never returned. Her letter, written years later from a small delta village, described her life as a weaver. A simple life. An anonymous life. But a life where she would die naturally, where she would be buried after her last breath, not before it. The letter ended with a single line that archaeological translators initially struggled to render. The hieratic script was blunt, uncommon in formal correspondence. The closest translation: "I would rather die forgotten than die honored." One woman refused, one woman escaped, one woman chose obscurity over eternity. It was a small victory. It changed nothing for the dozens of other women who were selected, prepared, and sealed into royal tombs across the Middle Kingdom period. But it was hers, and for the first time since archaeologists began uncovering the truth, there was evidence that not every concubine accepted her fate in silence. That resistance, even in the most absolute systems of control, was possible. Neferet's mummy is stored now in a climate control facility in Cairo. She is not on display. The Egyptian authorities deemed her story too complex for public exhibition. Her sarcophagus, with its beautiful gold leaf and turquoise inlays, is labeled simply concubine burial, dynasty theft. No mention of the wrapping. No mention of the 45 minutes her heart beat alone in sealed darkness. But she was real. She lived. She endured. And like Meret, like the 60 women in Mentuhotep's tomb, like the countless others whose bodies have not yet been found, she deserves more than sanitized museum labels. The practice eventually ended. As Egypt's New Kingdom period progressed, religious reforms slowly phased out living concubine burials in favor of symbolic offerings, statues, paintings, Shabti's representations instead of actual people. By the time of Ramesses II in 1250 BCE, the practice had been abandoned entirely. But for 5 centuries, it was standard, legal, sacred, and absolutely, horrifyingly real. Neferet's story is not over. There are more hidden histories waiting to be uncovered. If this moved you, tell me in the comments. If you want more stories that history tried to erase, subscribe, because their silence ends here.